We are in this interlude of John 11 and 12 right now. John 11 and 12 sort of present a bridge for us from all of the criticism and opposition Jesus has been facing. And then we're going to move soon into chapter 13, which begins the last few days of Jesus' life. Well, actually, chapter 13 begins the last night of Jesus' life. And we see that up close and in detail from a different perspective than the other synoptic gospels provide us. But in this section in John 11 and 12, that should already be on, Jim. Oh, you're probably changing the view. Gotcha. Sorry. So the John 11 and 12 are describing the final journey of Jesus to Jerusalem and what happens immediately when he enters the city. There were a couple things I asked you to pay attention to as we work our way through these two chapters. First of all, don't forget about the big picture. We tend to get focused in on so many details, but the big picture here is that in this section, you've got two groups of people reacting to Jesus in totally different ways. First of all, there's a group that just absolutely hates him because he threatens their power, their prestige, their place in the community. And those individuals have by this point launched an assassination plot against Jesus. And we're going to see that mature as we work through John 11 and 12. But also watch for the fact that Jesus will shift his focus. And this is what John records for us. Whereas up to this point, he has primarily been focused on the opposition of Jesus. Now he begins to focus in on how Jesus relates to his disciples and how he provides them with the final preparations for not only what is going to happen on Passover weekend, but also what's going to establish their faith so that they will literally take the gospel to every corner of the world during the first century. So that's part of what we need to see here. But also, we took a look last week then at the opening scene. We took a look at the beginning of the opening scene of these two chapters, which is the account of Lazarus' resurrection. And what we're going to see through the remaining verses that we haven't covered yet, and then into verse 54, is that Lazarus is resurrected, and immediately thereafter, Jesus once again retreats away from the public eye for a short period of time. So this is what we looked at last week. We looked at chapter 11, verses 1 through 16. And just as a quick reminder, the first thing that happened was that Lazarus' illness and then his death were reported to Jesus. We met Lazarus, we met Martha, we met Mary of Bethany. We don't know a lot about any of them. There are only a couple of other accounts that mention them in the New Testament, but it becomes obvious in looking at this record that Jesus loved these three siblings, and he cared a lot for them and obviously had spent time with them. Martha and Mary sent word to Jesus that Lazarus was ill, and upon hearing that, Jesus promptly delayed another 2 days, okay? And then after that 2-day delay, he proposed that he and his disciples leave to go back to Judea. Well, the disciples didn't like that idea because they knew that in Judea or in Jerusalem, there's a large group of people who are just waiting for them to show up again. And they have already threatened Jesus. They've tried to stone him, but were somehow limited from doing so. So the disciples are concerned about this trip, and Jesus encourages them in saying time is short. And you know, we can easily think of that as Lazarus' time was short, but in reality, Jesus is telling them that his time was short. He only has a little bit of time left. And so then Jesus ultimately shared the news of Lazarus' death with his disciples. And then we meet Thomas, and Thomas's expectation is fully that when they go to Judea, they are all going to die. And that is where we left off last week, was that statement in verse 16. So now we move forward, and we're going to get to the next section here. This is verses 17 through 27. And during this passage, Jesus is going to arrive in Bethany, and he's going to have an important conversation with Martha. Okay? So let's take a look at 17 through 27. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. And Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. And Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. And Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she told him. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who was to come into the world. Now it's interesting to think about this in the context of the other story that we have in the New Testament about Mary and Martha and the differences between those two stories. Because recall in the other story, we always think of Mary having done the thing that was better, where here it's Martha that's stepping out and making the statements of faith and things. So there's a little bit of a twist on what we usually think of in the differences between Mary and Martha. But we see here in verse 17 that Jesus learns that Lazarus has been dead already and in the tomb now for 4 days. Apparently, he was not aware of that yet. We don't know how he found out that Lazarus had died. We don't know when that was, and we don't know how long he had already been dead. But this 4-day window is thought to be something really significant to a Jew. And the reason that's important to a Jew is that a Jew believed that the soul left the body on the 4th day. Up until then, the soul was still kind of hanging out in the body. But on the 4th day, when the process of decay, the process of putrefaction had begun, when that happened, then that was a sign that the soul had now left for sure. So in their minds at this point, Lazarus was really dead. You know, this deal is done. It's irreversible. It's happened. It cannot be reversed. And Jesus now is officially, because he's 4 days late, he's officially too late. Okay? So then we move on to verses 18 to 20, and John mentions that they were close to Jerusalem, and as a result of that, many Jews had come out to Bethany since they were close. And they came out to mourn and to comfort the sisters in their loss. But in the grand scheme of things, this also then provides a couple of things. It provides a lot of witnesses to see what's going to happen. And so Jesus' fame and the knowledge of this event is going to spread rapidly and spread to the important areas, to Jerusalem particularly. But also it's going to limit, because he has all these witnesses and this popular support, it's going to limit the ability of the authorities to take action against him. So it's going to delay the inevitable, in that he's not going to be as easily accessible to them. He's not an easy target when there's all these believers hanging around him. Okay? Now in verse 20 we see that Martha goes to meet Jesus while Mary stays at home. And in some ways, as I mentioned a minute ago, this is sort of the opposite of what we think, but in other ways it's sort of similar. You know, Martha is the one that always she does stuff. Whether it's in her home or whether it's going out to meet Jesus, she's a person of action. She meets her obligations. She's more spontaneous. She's gonna do things like that. Whereas Mary, she's a little more introverted. It's a little harder for her to step outside of herself, and she's a little slower to act or to react. Okay? So things are a little more difficult for Mary. Verses 21 and 22, Martha then meets Jesus. And her initial greeting really isn't very kind. In fact, it's kind of an accusation. You're too late, Jesus. You didn't get here on time. This thing is already done. And John, the author, has already emphasized the fact that Jesus intentionally waited 2 days. So it's as if he were planning to make Martha mad. But yet we see a great statement of faith in this verse 22 when Martha says, even now God will give you whatever you ask. And it's interesting, her disappointment is great in this situation, but her disappointment is so great because her faith was so great. She knew Jesus had the ability to heal him if only he had been there, if only he had arrived. And so it's interesting that because so much was expected of him, the letdown was harder than ever. And we know that. You know that in your business life. There are people you can give a job to, and it seems like they're working 110 miles an hour already, but they'll get that thing done. And then there's other people that if they ever get out of their chair, you're going to applaud them. You know, I mean, that's just the way things are. And so, you know, it's when our expectations drive our reactions to things. And sometimes we're kind of unfair in that, aren't we? And we just sort of expect that the busy person, the person that's capable of things, can automatically take on this burden too. Go ahead, Jerry.
You can see that the faith here in Martha, she had to be really strong in faith, believing that Jesus could, bring him back to life.
Well, be careful of saying that she knew he could bring her back to life, because I'm not sure she knew that. In fact, that's going to be a question for you in just a second. So here's the question. Does Martha imply that she anticipated that Jesus would raise Lazarus from the dead?
No, she said if he were here.
Yeah, she's pointing backwards and saying, you needed to be here before. This is over now. But also look forward in verse 24 when she says, when Jesus says your brother will rise again, Martha says, well, I know he will rise in the resurrection at the last day. There's a resurrection, but it's not going to be in the next 10 minutes. You know, this is something that's going to happen. And then take a look down in verse 39. I know we're jumping ahead of ourselves a little bit, but when Jesus says to roll away the stone, it's Martha that says, don't go in there, it stinks. Don't do that. That's a big mistake. And so it's hard to say that she anticipates his literal bodily resurrection occurring right away. Lamar?
I got a question. Is she implying that if he had come earlier while Lazarus was only sick, then Jesus could have fixed the situation? Or is she saying that since it's the fourth day, now we have that other element involved in it, or both?
Well, I think it's both. I think the finality of his death in her mind, this thing is settled, that this is over. And if he had been here earlier, it could have gotten fixed. But it's interesting. She does say, I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. And it makes me think that she still has some sort of an outside hope that he's going to do something here. And it reminds me, remember back to Cana? When Jesus fixed the problem and his mother told those who were watching, she said, just do whatever he says. I don't know what he's going to do, but he'll do something. He fixes things. And I think that's what's going through Martha's head right here. Yeah. And so he's going to fix this somehow. I don't know what he's going to do. And resurrection, I think, was far from her mind. But she knew that he had the ability to do something. In verses 23 and 24, Jesus answered Martha and said, he will rise again. And his answer has two lines of meaning. One line is that Lazarus will be raised up in a matter of a few minutes. But the other is that there will be a resurrection, a bodily resurrection on the last day. And so Martha, though, hears only that second promise, that he will raise, and she says, well, I know he's going to be raised on the last day. And in fact, that comment also has a little bit of a negative undertone. It's kind of like, well, I know that, Jesus. Why are you telling me this? Did you come here all the way just to tell me that he's going to be resurrected in the last day? Is that why you're here? You know, there's kind of that undertone running underneath this as well. But Martha becomes really an example for us, as I mentioned at the end of last week's class, because we too have doubts that have to be dealt with and things that we don't understand that have to be dealt with. Okay, verses 25 and 26. Oh, I think I've gotten behind. No, there we go. Verses 25 and 26, Jesus makes another one of his I am claims. And this time he claims to be what? The resurrection and the life. And this is one of those promises that we all hold on to. And it's an important one. I want you to pay attention to four things about this promise. Number one, notice how Jesus shifts the tense. In verse 23 and verse 24, both Jesus and Martha say he will rise again. But this, he will, that's in the future. But when he goes to verse 25, he says, I am the resurrection and the life. And he shifts to the present. And so what he's telling Martha is that the decision to believe in his ability and who he is a now thing. That's not something for the future. What it is it's a now thing. It's a belief right now in what's and the challenge is for those who witness this thing to believe it right now, not in the future, and for Martha to believe it even though she doesn't know how Jesus is going to fix it. But the challenge is Jesus is saying, I am the resurrection. He will rise, but I am. Okay? So don't forget about that. Secondly, notice the two terms that Jesus speaks of. He speaks of resurrection. He is resurrection. Now, when you think about it, resurrection is a point in time. It's an action that happens and it's done, right? But Jesus says he is also the life. So it's kind of like, remember back to geometry, you have line segments that begin at a point and then there's a ray going off in this direction and it goes on forever. That's what this is. The end point here, the beginning point is, the beginning point's a better word for it. The beginning point, that's resurrection. But life is this continuum that goes on forever. And that's what Jesus is talking about. He's talking about eternal life. And it begins in the understanding of this resurrection. And then Jesus makes two applications for those who believe. And that's in verses 25 and 26. If you read halfway through 25, it starts, he who believes in me will live even though he dies. And so what he's saying there is that even though a believer dies physically, he will live spiritually. And he goes on then in verse 26 to say, whoever chooses to believe in me while living physically will never die spiritually. And so Jesus is linking those two realms of existence, the physical world and the spiritual world. Jesus is just simply linking them right together. And he's talking about both a physical resurrection, but also an ongoing spiritual life. And then Jesus asks the question, and he challenges Mary as to where she is at. He's just said, I am the resurrection and the life, and now he says, do you believe this? And so now it's really no longer about dead Lazarus. It's about her. The question is to her. That's who this thing is aimed at. And remember, we read last week that this whole incident is about causing people to believe. That came from verse 14 when Jesus had told them, Lazarus is dead. For your sake, I'm glad I was not there so that you may believe. This is all about bringing belief into their world. Go ahead, Lamar.
And he's talking to us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the promise that he gives about Lazarus to Martha is also for us. And we are to identify with every one of these characters in the book. We're to identify with the people at Cana. We're to identify with Nicodemus. We're to identify with the woman in Samaria. We identify with each one of these players in some form or fashion. And their faith needs to become our faith. And then in verse 27, we have it. And this is Martha's great confession of faith. I believe that you are the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God, who was to come into the world. And there she has it. It's interesting, we read all the time about Peter's confession, right? You ever heard of Martha's confession? Neither have I. But there it is right there. And it's in almost the identical words, right? So that's very fascinating. She has arrived at the truth which John concludes this gospel with. Remember, chapter 20, verse 31. These things are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you have life in his name. And so she has arrived at that critical pinnacle of truth. But, there's a but here. But her confession is only about Jesus being the Messiah. She doesn't really respond to Jesus with what he has just told her, and that I am the resurrection and the life. Martha says nothing about that and what her belief is on that. And she doesn't include anything in this about the promise of a resurrected life. So does that mean she missed the point? No. Not at all. She represents us because we all don't understand everything. And that's where Martha was here. She didn't understand everything, but as much as she could understand, she was gung-ho. She's all in. And we are in the same boat. Our faith is limited. Our perseverance is limited. Our endurance is limited. All of those, we all have doubts that rise and slap us in the face. Sometimes they put us in the ground for a while. But nonetheless, this is all about believing in spite of. Believing in spite of. Go ahead, Lamar.
Yeah, we approach God with just our faith in all of this. And I think all along the line, every one of these stories just said, let this strengthen your faith. Be strengthened your faith by this. So that we can come to full belief
Absolutely.
and assurance through all of these events.
Absolutely. So now we move forward and we get to the miracle itself. In verses 28 through 32, Jesus asks for Mary, who comes to meet him. And after she had said this, after Martha had said this, made that confession, she went back and called her sister Mary again. The teacher is here, she said, and is asking for you. When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. And when the Jews who had been with Mary in the house comforting her noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. Verse 28, at least in the NIV, says that Martha came back and called her sister Mary aside. The word really means privately or secretly. So she wanted to just talk to Mary about this. Martha just wanted to talk to Mary about this. Also, the word teacher or rabbi. Now, that's an unusual word for a woman to use because the Jewish rabbis didn't teach women. The teachings, the prophecies of the Old Testament were taught only to men through the official teaching structure. And what this suggests to us is that Jesus, the teacher, had spent time with both Mary and Martha opening up the Old Testament for their understanding. Okay, so her use of this word is an interesting one. Also notice from this that John is beginning to make that shift that we've been talking about. John is focusing in on the friends of Jesus and what's going on in their minds and their lives and how he encourages them. There's a lot of people around, people who come out from Jerusalem to provide comfort and things, but Jesus has his eyes primarily on Martha and Mary in this encounter. Okay? And so Jesus is starting to, laser focus on those who he really needs to work with while he still has time left. Verses 29 and 31 both tell us that Mary got up quickly. And so Jesus' presence changed her overall demeanor, her mood. If she was in a funk, it got her out of her funk. And it stirred her out of her immobility and her deep grief and caused her to take action. In verse 32, Mary arrives at into Jesus' audience, and she fell at Jesus' feet. And that just implies such a deep reverence for him and who he is, and such a deep friendship. And she too then makes a statement of faith. It's the same as Martha's initial comment when she says, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And it's the same thing Martha had said, right? So she too shares her understanding that Jesus would have been able to have done something in the past. Undoubtedly, the sisters had talked about that. Jesus needs to get here now, because they both say the same thing. So undoubtedly, they had talked about it at some point. Verses 33 through 37, we have the prelude to the miracle. When Jesus saw her weeping, saw Mary weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. And Jesus wept. And then the Jews said, see how he loved him? But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? And they're speaking that thing that's in everybody's mind, it seems like. Couldn't he have fixed this? Now in verse 33, we see the word weeping used twice. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping. And this word for weeping here is being deeply affected, and it's a loud wailing. This is a public grief that Jesus observes in both Mary and the Jews who had come out from Jerusalem. Then we see how Jesus reacts, and this is in verse 33 also. The NIV says he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Two different words. The King James says he groaned in spirit and was troubled. Literally, the words mean he became grim of spirit and he yielded to the deepest emotions. And clearly then, Jesus is being affected by the grief of others. And you've seen this, and you've been affected by the grief of others. I can remember when my dad died, and he died young. He was only 56, but his dad had died in his early 40s. So my dad only had his dad until he was into his early to mid-teens was all. And then his dad died of horrible cancer death. I never knew my grandfather. And then I can recall when my dad died. Well, let me back up one other step. When my grandfather died, his brother sort of took over the rearing and raising of my dad in many ways. He became the father figure for my dad's life. Flash forward to when my dad died then, and I saw Uncle Don come in, who had been my father's surrogate father. And I remember when Uncle Don walked in the back of the funeral home room, and he just lost it. And, you know, I was feeling bad for me, but at that moment, he demonstrated a grief that it was awful. And you've seen that too, in your family life and your occasions that have come up. You've seen that too. And that's what Jesus witnessed here. And Jesus knows that in some way the pressure's on him. Go ahead, Ron.
Well, I was just going to say, back to that word trouble, is there a possibility there was a lot of unbelievers there as well?
Sure.
And he felt that.
Yeah. So those two words, he yielded to deep emotion. That means his emotion was felt, it was expressed, it was not suppressed, and Jesus just gave into it. He gave into that deep emotion. But the other word, the word that says became grim in spirit, that has an undertone of anger. That has an undertone of a reaction to something. And here's my question for you to think about for a second. What is Jesus' anger directed at?
Satan, evil, the death. This didn't have to happen. The sin that came into the world.
Death itself. You're right. And here's something that I came across in my readings. This is what John Calvin said about this passage. He said, Christ does not come to this is old language because he's an old guy. Christ does not come to the sepulchre as an idle spectator, but like a wrestler preparing for the contest. No wonder that he groans, for the violent tyranny of death that he had to overcome was standing right before his eyes. Yeah. Isn't that a powerful image now when you think of that and how Jesus is thinking of this? That's so much deeper than you and I understand what's going on in this situation. And so in verse 35, Jesus weeps. And this is a different word. This is not the same weeping that we saw in verse 33. This is a quiet shedding of tears. This is a heart breaking in Jesus' life. As a human, he identifies with the reality of death and its grief, but as divinity, he groans under the burden that he has to fix it and make it right. 36 and 37, two different reactions when Jesus shows his emotion like that, when he demonstrates what he's all about. Two different reactions. Some are overwhelmed by his obvious love for Lazarus and his family. Some were overwhelmed by that. But others play the blame game. They see his tears as his failure. He's sad because he can't help, because he missed it, because he missed his chance. He's sad. But notice that when they say he could have helped, they're also saying he has powers beyond what anybody else has. So even in their opposition to him, they're making statements of faith. In reality, Jesus has delayed his own arrival by 2 days, and he is going to fix this situation in a way that nobody anticipated. And the message for us is that it is never too late. No matter how difficult it seems, or how deep the waters are, or how troubled we are, it is never too late. And so we get to verses 38 through 44, and we have the miracle itself. And the miracle is told very simply, very straightforward, very matter of fact. Here it is. Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. Take away the stone, he said. But Lord, said Martha, the sister of the dead man, by this time there's a bad odor, for he's been there 4 days. And then Jesus said, did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? So they took away the stone. And then Jesus looked up and said, Father, I thank you that you've heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. And when he had said this, Jesus called out in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The dead man came out. His hands and feet were wrapped in strips of linen and a cloth around his face. And Jesus said to him, take off the grave clothes and let him go. Jesus arrives at the tomb, verse 38. The same word is used for his deep agitation as it was back in verse 33, and how combination of sad and angry, that grim reality, that same word is used. Verse 39, he orders that the stone be moved away from the mouth of the tomb, and Martha expresses her shock that he would even think of such a request. It would expose the decaying body of her brother. And this tells us really that I think she had no idea what was about to happen. Her words emphasize the impossibility of what was about to take place. Verse 40, Jesus tells all who were present that what is about to take place is not for me, it's for God's glory. Verses 41 and 42, the stone is removed, and Jesus, before summoning Lazarus, Jesus speaks to his Father. And it's interesting, he doesn't make any request of God. All he says is he thanks God for their relationship and for their fellowship. And he directs the witnesses to see what God does here. And he deflects all the glory to his Father. This is what we've been talking about the last several weeks now, in that he consistently points to his Father as the one who empowers and promotes him. He says that the purpose in speaking publicly about the Father and to the Father is so that they would recognize and believe that he is actually from God himself. Verse 43 and 44, Jesus calls to Lazarus in a commanding voice. He does not say, if you want, come out. He commands him to come out. And Lazarus emerges from the grave with his grave wrappings still intact. I want you to think about that image for a second and what it means to be freed from the power of death. And as someone comes out of a tomb with grave clothes still on, and then Jesus says, okay, unwrap it. Take it off. And I can, I haven't unwrapped a corpse. But I have had the chance to have a lot of burn victims over the years. And I can remember one child he was up north on a campfire. They were having a campfire on vacation up north, and he fell into the ring. It was stone ringed, and his face contacted some of those hot stones. Just horrible, horrible, disfiguring burns. And he would have his care. Most of it was done over in Ann Arbor at the burn center over there. And he would come in to see me every so often after he'd had a procedure, and I would be the one to get to peel off the layers and get to see. And it was such a revelation to see what was happening as they did their work, and of course God did his work in terms of healing this child, and how it was nothing short of a miracle what was able to be done with him. It was incredible. Go ahead, Lamar.
This is what happens to us when we come out of the water.
Bingo. Bingo. You're right. You're right. It's that. We're all right now, in a physical sense, we're all dead men walking. But in a spiritual sense, there is no death. Jesus means life, and life only. Jerry?
Just another thought about when Jesus spoke. He said to them, unbind them, and that's the same with us today. Unbind us from the world of sin.
That's right. That's right. Leave those things behind you. It's a new life. Leave that stuff behind. Okay, we'll wrap this up real quick here. For Lazarus himself, just imagine the change in his life from that moment forward. I cannot even imagine it, can you? He's no longer under the spell of sin and death. He would die again, but never to stay dead. And think about what Jesus' words, I am resurrection and I am life. Think about what that meant to Lazarus. And what that might mean and does mean for us. That's what this whole thing is about. John records this because it was so powerful in the way that it testified of how God works through his Son. And once again, we see people wrestling with that question, do you believe or don't you? Do you believe or don't you? Do you believe or don't you? And that's the question that has to be answered. And that's what John is providing us with, evidence after evidence after evidence after evidence. And you can't look at it in a serious way without, I think, being convicted. So may God bless us to that end, right? God is good all the time.